Have you ever done something so out of character, so reckless, that even while you were doing it, you couldn't believe it was happening? Like you were watching yourself from the outside, thinking, what the hell am I doing? That was me, one night, not too long ago. And let me tell you, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. It started like any other night. I was sitting alone in my tiny apartment, the kind of quiet that almost feels suffocating. You know that feeling? When the silence is so loud it practically screams at you. My phone was sitting there on the coffee table, just staring at me. I'd been ghosting everyone, my friends, family, even myself, if I'm being honest. I was in one of those moods where nothing seemed to matter, and I thought, why not do something crazy? Just for one night. So, I picked it up and opened this app my buddy had been raving about. He said it was perfect for people who needed a distraction. A distraction. That's all I was looking for. I didn't want a connection or even a conversation. Really, just something, anything, to break the monotony. Then I matched with her. Well, I thought I did. Her profile was vague, a blurry photo, just enough to catch your eye, and a bio that seemed like it was written just for me. She was confident, clever, and straight to the point. No games, no pretense. It felt like exactly what I needed. We started messaging, and it was easy. Too easy. She was flirty, but not over the top. It was like she understood where my head was at without me having to spell it out. Before I knew it, we were making plans. Now, here's where things get weird. There was something about her that felt familiar. It's hard to explain. Maybe it was the way she phrased things or the subtle hints in her profile. But I convinced myself I was overthinking it. Come on, man. It's just one night, I told myself. So I gave her my address and waited. Fast forward an hour later, I'm pacing my living room. Nervous? Sure. Excited? A little. But mostly, I was just curious. And then, there it was, a knock at the door. I don't know what I expected, but when I opened it, I froze. My heart felt like it stopped beating for a second. My throat went dry. It wasn't just some stranger standing there. It was Ethan's mom. Yeah, you heard me right. Ethan, my best friend since high school. The guy I've shared everything with, who knows me better than anyone. His mom. Right there, in front of me, looking just as stunned as I felt. For a few seconds, we just stood there, staring at each other, like we were in some kind of alternate reality. She broke the silence first. She said my name, softly, almost like a question, and all I could manage was a shaky, What are you doing here? Her answer? It was simple, honest, and completely shook me to my core. But I'll get to that in a minute. What I can tell you right now is that this night didn't go anywhere close to how I thought it would. What started as a harmless way to escape turned into something that still keeps me up at night, wondering what I could have done differently. If you're curious to find out what happened next, trust me, you're going to want to stick around for this. It's not just a story. It's the kind of thing that makes you question everything you think you know about people and yourself. Hit that subscribe button, because this is just the beginning, and trust me, it only gets crazier from here. I stood there, frozen, my mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. It was as if the entire world had flipped upside down. Ethan's mom, standing in my doorway, looking just as confused as I felt. Let me give you some context here because, honestly, you need it to understand just how insane this moment was for me. Ethan and I had been best friends since high school. We'd been through everything together, breakups, road trips, those long nights where you talk about life like you've got it all figured out. If there was anyone I could count on, it was him. And his mom? Mrs. Baker, as I'd always called her, had always been, well, Ethan's mom. She was kind, warm, and always had this way of making you feel at home whenever you were around her. I can still remember the smell of her kitchen, cookies in the oven, coffee brewing. She was the type of person who seemed to have her life together, even when you knew things probably weren't perfect. After Ethan's dad passed away when we were in college, I noticed a change in her. She became quieter, more reserved. But I guess that was to be expected. She'd lost her husband, the love of her life, and suddenly she was a single mom, trying to hold it all together. Over the years, I didn't see her as much. Life happens, you know? Ethan and I stayed close, but visits to his place became less frequent. Still, whenever I did see her, she'd always greet me with that same warmth. I never thought of her as anything more than my best friend's mom. Not once. Until that night. So there we were, staring at each other, the weight of the situation hanging in the air like a storm about to break. She looked different. Not in a bad way, just not how I remembered her. She wasn't the picture-perfect mom from our high school days anymore. She looked tired, sure, but also vulnerable. And there was something in her eyes, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Can I come in?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated. Every instinct in me screamed that this was a bad idea. But instead of saying no, I stepped aside and let her in. She walked in slowly, looking around my small, cluttered apartment. I couldn't tell if she was judging me or just taking it all in, but it didn't matter. I was too busy trying to figure out what the hell was going on. "So," I said, my voice awkward and strained, "what are you doing here?" She sat down on my couch, smoothing out the wrinkles in her dress. It was a simple black dress, understated but elegant. The kind of thing you wear when you're trying to blend in but still look put together. "I didn't know it was you," she admitted, her eyes meeting mine. "Not until I got here." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. I felt my stomach drop. She didn't know? That meant she was on the app, too. I sat down across from her, my mind racing. "Why are you even?" I trailed off, not sure how to finish the question. She gave me a small, sad smile. "Why am I here?" "I could ask you the same thing." Touché. For a while, we just sat there in silence. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, but I didn't know where to start. And then she spoke again, her voice softer this time. I needed to feel something. Anything. It's been a long time since I felt. She stopped, her words hanging in the air. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure I understood. Or maybe I did, and I just didn't want to admit it. Because the truth was, I knew exactly what she meant. That's why I was on the app in the first place. We started talking then, really talking. About life, about loneliness, about how things don't always turn out the way you think they will. She told me about the struggles of being a single mom, about how hard it was to watch Ethan grow up and move on with his life while she stayed stuck in the same place. And I told her about my own struggles, the breakup that had left me feeling like a shell of myself. The nights I spent alone, wondering if I'd ever feel normal again. It was cathartic in a way. Like we were two broken people finding solace in each other's company. But then, as the night went on, something shifted. The conversation grew deeper, more personal. The space between us felt smaller, even though we were still sitting on opposite ends of the room. I could feel the tension building, subtle but undeniable. And then she moved closer. "I shouldn't be here," she said, her voice barely audible. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Maybe not." "But you are." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time, I saw her not as Ethan's mom, but as a woman. A woman who was hurting, just like me. And in that moment, everything changed. As she sat there, inches away from me, the world outside felt like it had disappeared. The city noise, the glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds, it all faded into the background. It was just us. And I couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this connection, was teetering on the edge of something I couldn't take back. Her words echoed in my mind. I shouldn't be here. She was right, of course. A part of me knew this was a terrible idea. Ethan was my best friend. His mom wasn't just some stranger I'd stumbled upon in a random twist of fate. This was messy, complicated, and could blow up my life and hers in ways I didn't even want to imagine. But there was another part of me, a quieter voice that I'd been ignoring for years, that whispered something different. It told me that she wasn't just Ethan's mom right now. She was a woman who'd been through her own storms, who was sitting here with me, choosing not to walk away. And maybe she was here because she saw something in me that she needed. I leaned back, trying to create some physical space between us, but it didn't help. The tension was thick, almost suffocating. I didn't know it would be you, she said again, her voice softer this time. I didn't either, I replied, though the words felt hollow. Because deep down, I realized there had been signs, little things I'd ignored. The familiarity in her tone, the way she phrased certain things in her profile. I'd brushed it off, not wanting to overthink, but now it was all too clear. She sighed, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the situation had finally settled on her. This is crazy, she said, a small, humorless laugh escaping her lips. Yeah, I said, managing a weak smile. That's one word for it. The room fell silent again, but it wasn't the kind of silence that begged to be filled. It was the kind that forced you to sit with your thoughts, no matter how uncomfortable they were. Finally, she stood up, smoothing her dress nervously. I should go, she said, though she didn't move toward the door. I stood too, my heart pounding. Maybe you should, I said, though the words felt like a lie even as I said them. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, it felt like everything stopped. There was a vulnerability in her gaze, a quiet plea that I couldn't ignore. And before I knew what I was doing, I reached out and touched her arm. Wait, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't pull away. This is complicated, I said, struggling to find the right words. But you're here, and I'm here, and I don't know. Maybe that means something. Her lips parted, as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. Instead, she just stood there, staring at me like I was the only person in the world who could understand what she was feeling. And maybe I was. She closed the distance between us, so close now that I could feel the warmth of her breath. My mind was screaming at me to stop, to think about Ethan, about the consequences, about everything that could go wrong. But my heart? My heart was louder. Before I could second-guess myself, she leaned in, her hand resting lightly on my chest. It wasn't a kiss, not yet, but it was close enough that I knew where this was headed. Are you sure? She asked, her voice trembling. No, I said honestly. But I don't want you to go. And then it happened. It wasn't rushed or frantic. It was slow, tentative, like we were both testing the waters of something we knew we shouldn't be diving into. But once it started, there was no going back. The kiss was soft at first, almost hesitant, but it didn't stay that way. It deepened, grew more urgent, more desperate, like we were both trying to fill the emptiness that had been gnawing at us for so long. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not Ethan, not the consequences, not the voice in my head screaming that this was a mistake. All that mattered was her warmth, her touch, the way she looked at me like I was the only person who could see her for who she really was. When we finally pulled away, she looked at me, her cheeks flushed, her breathing unsteady. I don't know what we're doing, she said, her voice barely audible. Me neither, I admitted. But it feels right, doesn't it? She didn't answer, but the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. We spent the rest of the night talking, laughing, and, yes, crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. But it wasn't just about the physical. It was about connection, about finding comfort in each other's brokenness. When she finally left, the sun was starting to rise. I stood in the doorway, watching her walk away, and I couldn't help but wonder what this meant, for me, for her, for Ethan. But one thing was certain. Life as I knew it would never be the same again. As the door clicked shut behind her, I leaned against it, my head spinning. What had I just done? My heart was racing so fast it felt like it might burst out of my chest. Part of me wanted to scream, to break something, to shake myself out of this fog I'd fallen into. But the other part? That part wanted to replay every single moment of what had just happened. I stood there for a long time, staring at nothing, my mind jumping between 1,000 thoughts at once. Ethan's mom. Mrs. Baker. How did we get here? I thought back to her face, the way her eyes softened when she looked at me, the quiet sadness behind her smile. I couldn't ignore it, and honestly, I didn't want to. She wasn't just Ethan's mom anymore. She was a woman. One who had opened up to me in ways I didn't expect, who made me feel something I hadn't felt in years. But then there was Ethan, my best friend. The guy who would drop everything to help me, no questions asked. If he ever found out. God, I couldn't even finish the thought. The guilt was already eating away at me, twisting my stomach into knots. Why was she even on that app? Did Ethan know? Did he have any idea how lonely she must have been to end up in a situation like this? And what about me? What kind of person did this make me? I walked over to the couch and sank into it, my head in my hands. My brain felt like it was on fire, battling between guilt and something else. Curiosity, maybe. Or longing. I couldn't tell anymore. I told myself it was just a one-time thing. A moment of weakness for both of us. We were two people who had found each other at the wrong time, in the wrong circumstances, and we'd made a mistake. That's all it was. But was it? The truth was, I didn't regret it. Not really. And that scared me more than anything. The next few days were a blur. I tried to distract myself, throwing myself into work, ignoring calls, and avoiding social media. But no matter what I did, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Every quiet moment brought me back to that night, to the way she'd looked at me, the way she'd made me feel seen. I kept checking my phone, half hoping and half dreading that she'd text me. But she didn't. And with every passing hour, the silence grew heavier, like a weight pressing down on my chest. Then, one evening, Ethan called. "Hey man," he said, his voice as casual as ever. "You've been quiet lately. Everything okay?" I froze, the phone pressed to my ear, my mind racing. Did he know? Had she told him? Or was this just a coincidence? "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just been busy, you know." "Busy doing what?" he asked, laughing. "It's not like you have a life these days." I forced a chuckle, my stomach twisting. He wasn't wrong. Before that night, my life had been painfully dull, a monotonous cycle of work and solitude. But now? Now it felt like everything had been thrown into chaos. "Anyway," he continued, "Mom's been asking about you. She said she hadn't seen you in forever. You should come by sometime." My heart skipped a beat. Yeah," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Maybe. Been kind of swamped lately." He didn't push, thank God, but the conversation left me shaken. If Mrs. Baker was asking about me, did that mean she was thinking about that night too? Or was she just trying to keep up appearances? The days turned into a week and then another. I kept telling myself that it was over, that I'd moved on, but the truth was I hadn't. Not even close. Every time I thought about her, it was like a spark igniting something deep inside me, something I couldn't ignore, no matter how hard I tried. And then, one evening, it happened. My phone buzzed, and when I saw her name on the screen, my heart stopped. "Hi," the message read. "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen, my mind racing. What did she want? Was she going to tell me it was a mistake, that it could never happen again? Or was she going to say what I'd secretly been hoping to hear, that she couldn't stop thinking about me either? I didn't know what to say, so I typed out a simple reply, "Yeah." "When?" Her response came quickly, "Tonight?" I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Every part of me knew this was a bad idea, that I was walking into something I couldn't walk back out of. But I couldn't say no. "Okay," I typed. "Come over." When I hit send, my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. I didn't know what was going to happen, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I'd been staring at the clock for what felt like hours, my nerves a tangled mess. Each tick of the second hand felt like a countdown to something I wasn't prepared for. I kept telling myself that this wasn't going to be anything more than a conversation, a way to clear the air, to make sure we both understood that what had happened was a mistake. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. When I heard the knock on the door, my heart jumped into my throat. I stood frozen for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob as if opening it would seal my fate. Finally, I took a deep breath and turned the handle. She was standing there, wearing a simple coat over her shoulders and holding a small purse. Her eyes met mine, and for a second, neither of us said anything. The air between us felt electric, like the moment right before a storm breaks. "Hi," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "Hi," I replied, stepping aside to let her in. She walked in slowly, her movements tentative, like she wasn't sure if she was making the right decision. I closed the door behind her, and for a moment we stood there in awkward silence. "I didn't know if I should come," she said finally, her eyes fixed on the floor. "But you did," I said, my voice more confident than I felt. She nodded, her gaze still avoiding mine. I needed to talk to you." I gestured toward the couch, and we both sat down, the space between us feeling both too far and too close at the same time. "I've been thinking about that night," she began, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her purse. "About what happened. About us." "Me too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked up then, her eyes meeting mine for the first time since she'd walked in. "I don't know what this is," she said, her voice trembling. "I just know that I can't stop thinking about you." Her words hit me like a freight train. Part of me felt relief, knowing I wasn't alone in this. But another part felt the weight of the situation crashing down on me all over again. "Neither can I said, the honesty spilling out before I could stop it. The conversation started hesitantly, each of us feeling our way through the minefield we'd created. But as the minutes passed, the walls between us began to crumble. She told me about her divorce, about how lonely she'd felt in the years since Ethan's dad had passed away. She talked about how hard it was to watch her friends move on, find new love, while she felt stuck in the same place, unable to let go of the life she'd lost. "People think you just get over it," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "But you don't. You just learn to live with the emptiness." Her vulnerability caught me off guard. This wasn't the Mrs. Baker I'd known growing up, the warm, put-together woman who always had a kind word and a smile. This was someone who was struggling, just like me. And for the first time, I didn't see her as Ethan's mom. I saw her as a person. "I get it," I said, my voice soft. "I felt that way too. After my breakup. I thought I was fine, but I wasn't. I kept telling myself I didn't need anyone, but the truth is, I've been lonely for a long time." She looked at me then, her eyes searching mine. "It's hard, isn't it? Admitting that?" "Yeah," I said. "But it's the truth." The conversation grew deeper, more intimate as the hours slipped by. We talked about our fears, our regrets, the things we wished we could change. It wasn't just about that night anymore. It felt personal, raw, like we were peeling back layers we hadn't even known were there. At one point, she reached out and placed her hand on mine. The gesture was small, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt through me. "I shouldn't be here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe not," I said, my eyes locked on hers. "But you are." She didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she leaned in closer, her gaze never leaving mine. I could feel the warmth of her breath, the tension in the air so thick it was almost suffocating. "I don't know what this is," she said, her voice trembling. "But I can't walk away from it." Neither could I. The moment hung between us, fragile and electric. It would have been so easy to pull back, to put an end to whatever this was before it went any further. But I didn't. Instead, I closed the distance between us, my lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was soft at first, hesitant, but quickly deepened into something more. It wasn't just about desire. It was about connection, about finding comfort in each other's brokenness. It was messy and complicated and everything it shouldn't have been, but in that moment, it felt right. When we finally pulled away, she looked at me, her cheeks flushed, her breathing unsteady. "This is dangerous," she said, her voice barely audible. "I know," I said. "But I don't care." Neither of us said anything after that. We didn't need to. The lines had already been crossed, the boundaries blurred beyond recognition. As the night stretched on, we found ourselves drawn back to each other again and again, the connection between us growing stronger with every passing moment. And even though I knew this couldn't last, that it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down, I couldn't bring myself to stop. Not yet. It started innocently enough, just another quiet evening, another conversation. We told ourselves it would only be this, talking, sharing, finding comfort in the unspoken understanding we seemed to have. But the truth? The truth was that the lines had already blurred beyond repair, and deep down, we both knew it. One moment, we were sitting on the couch, her hand resting lightly on mine as we talked about everything and nothing. The room felt warm, not from the temperature, but from the closeness between us, the kind of closeness that makes the world outside disappear. And then it happened. I don't even know how it started. Maybe it was the way she looked at me, her eyes soft and full of something I couldn't quite name. Or maybe it was the way her hand lingered on mine, her touch sending a spark through me that I couldn't ignore. Whatever it was, one moment we were talking and the next we weren't. Her lips met mine, hesitant at first, as if testing the waters. But once the barrier was broken, there was no going back. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more desperate, like we were both trying to drown out the voices in our heads screaming at us to stop. It felt exhilarating and horrifying all at once. For a few fleeting moments, it was easy to forget everything else. To forget who we were, how we got here, and what this could mean for the people we cared about. It was just her and me, caught in this whirlwind of emotions we couldn't control. But the reality hit me midway through, like a cold wave crashing over me. What would Ethan think? What would this mean for our friendship, for her family? For me? My mind raced with questions I didn't want to answer, guilt clawing at the edges of my thoughts. But even as those thoughts swirled in my head, I couldn't bring myself to stop. Her hands were on my face, her touch grounding me even as it sent my emotions spiraling. I pulled her closer, the weight of what we were doing pressing down on me even as I gave into it. When we finally pulled away, both of us breathless, the silence that followed was deafening. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions, guilt, longing, fear. She started, but her voice trailed off. I know, I said, though I wasn't sure if I really did. She stood up, pacing the room as she ran her fingers through her hair. This is insane, she said, her voice trembling. What are we doing? I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. She turned to face me, her eyes searching mine. We can't keep doing this, she said, though the way she looked at me told me she wasn't sure if she believed her own words. I know, I said again, the words feeling hollow even as I said them. The tension in the room was unbearable, the weight of our actions hanging between us like a storm cloud. I wanted to say something, anything, to make it better, but I didn't know how. Finally, she sank back onto the couch, her head in her hands. This is going to destroy everything, she said, her voice barely audible. I sat down beside her, the guilt in my chest threatening to crush me. Maybe, I said, my voice soft. But it doesn't have to. She looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. How can you say that? What about Ethan? What about everything? I don't know, I said, the honesty cutting through me like a knife. I don't have the answers. All I know is that I can't pretend this didn't happen. I can't pretend I don't feel this. Her face crumpled, and she let out a shaky breath. Neither can I, she said, her voice breaking. We sat there in silence for what felt like hours, the weight of our actions pressing down on us. Every thought in my head was a battle between guilt and longing, between what I knew was right and what I couldn't seem to let go of. When she finally stood to leave, the look in her eyes was one I'd never forget. It was a mix of sadness and resolve, like she was trying to hold on to something even as it slipped through her fingers. I need time to think, she said, her voice barely audible. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As the door closed behind her, the silence in the room was deafening. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty space where she'd been, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. What had we done? What were we going to do? The questions haunted me, their answers just out of reach. But one thing was clear, there was no going back now. The lines had been crossed, the boundaries shattered. And no matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. The morning after, the silence was unbearable. She had left before the sun was fully up, her words few and her eyes unreadable. There was no dramatic goodbye, no promises made or broken. Just a quiet, almost painful glance before she slipped out the door, leaving me sitting on the edge of my bed, feeling like the air had been sucked out of the room. I sat there for hours, unable to move, my thoughts spiraling out of control. Regret, disbelief, longing, they all swirled together in a storm I couldn't escape. My apartment, already small, felt like it was closing in on me, every corner of it a reminder of what had happened. I kept replaying the night in my head, trying to make sense of it. The way she'd looked at me, the way she'd opened up, the way we'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. It all felt surreal, like a dream I couldn't wake up from. But it wasn't a dream. It was real, and the weight of that reality was crushing. I told myself I'd figure it out later, that I'd give her the space she needed to think. But the truth was, I didn't know what I was supposed to do. Should I call her? Apologize? Pretend it never happened? And then Ethan called. The sound of my phone ringing snapped me out of my daze, and for a moment I just stared at the screen, his name glowing like a warning sign. My heart raced as I picked up, my hand trembling. "Hey man," he said, his voice as casual as ever. "You've been MIA. Everything okay?" I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to sound steady. "Yeah, just been busy." "Busy?" he teased. "Doing what? It's not like you have a social life these days." I forced a laugh, though it felt hollow. "Work, mostly. You know how it is." "Right," he said, his tone light, but there was something about the way he said it that made my stomach twist. Did he know? Was this his way of testing me? "So, anyway," he continued, "Mom's been asking about you. She said you haven't been around in a while." My heart stopped. "Oh," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Yeah, I guess it's been a while." "You should come by sometime," he said. "She misses having you around." "We both do." I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to figure out if there was any hidden meaning in his words. Did she tell him? Was this some kind of setup? "I'll try," I said finally, my voice shaky. "Been kind of swamped lately." "No rush," he said, his tone easy. "Just don't be a stranger." When the call ended, I felt like I'd just run a marathon. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. Did he know? Was he just being friendly, or was there something more to it? The rest of the day passed in a haze. I couldn't focus on anything, couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leapt, half expecting it to be her. But it wasn't. The silence between us grew heavier with each passing hour, and the weight of it was suffocating. By the time the sun set, I was a mess. I kept checking my phone, hoping for some kind of sign from her, but there was nothing. Just the deafening silence and the overwhelming guilt that I couldn't escape. And then, late that night, there was a knock at my door. My heart stopped as I stared at the door, the sound echoing in the stillness of the apartment. For a moment I didn't move, didn't breathe, my mind racing with possibilities. When I finally opened it, she was standing there, her face pale, her eyes red like she'd been crying. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I stepped aside, letting her in without a word. She walked in slowly, her movements hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she should be here. "I didn't know who else to talk to," she said, her voice trembling. "What's wrong?" I asked, though I wasn't sure if I really wanted to know the answer. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and sadness. "I think Ethan knows," she said, her voice breaking. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaky. "I don't know," she said, shaking her head. "He's been different. Asking questions, looking at me like he's trying to figure something out. I think he suspects something." My mind raced, trying to process what she was saying. If Ethan knew, or even suspected, what would that mean for us? For him? "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice desperate. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely audible. The silence that followed was suffocating, the weight of her words pressing down on me like a physical force. "Maybe this was a mistake," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Maybe we should just stop." Her words felt like a knife to my chest, but I knew she was right. "Maybe," I said, though the thought of letting her go felt unbearable. We sat there in silence, the tension between us thicker than ever. Neither of us knew what to say, what to do. But one thing was clear, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As she left that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was just beginning. And whatever was coming, it was going to change everything. I spent days, no, weeks, replaying everything in my head. Every word, every look, every touch. It was like a loop I couldn't escape, and no matter how much I tried to distract myself, it always crept back in during the quiet moments. The nights were the worst. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I'd find myself thinking about her. About us. Was I a terrible person? Was she? Or were we just two broken people who had stumbled into each other's lives at exactly the wrong moment? I couldn't figure it out. Every time I thought I had an answer, it slipped through my fingers like water, leaving me more confused than before. Some people would call it betrayal. And maybe they'd be right. Ethan was my best friend, had been for years. He trusted me, counted on me, and I'd crossed a line that should have never even been approached. But then, there was another side to it. She wasn't just Ethan's mom anymore. She was a person, someone who'd been through unimaginable loss, who'd spent years trying to hold it together for everyone else while quietly falling apart inside. And me? I wasn't much better. I'd been drifting for so long, stuck in my own cycle of loneliness and regret. Maybe what we'd done wasn't about betrayal. Maybe it was about finding solace in the only place we could. But even as I tried to convince myself of that, the guilt gnawed at me. Every time Ethan called, every time he mentioned her, I felt like I was walking a tightrope, one misstep away from everything coming crashing down. "You've been weird lately," he said one afternoon, his tone half joking, but laced with curiosity. "What's going on with you?" "Nothing," I lied, forcing a laugh. "Just busy." "Busy doing what?" he pressed. "Work," I said quickly, trying to change the subject. "Speaking of which, how's your mom doing?" The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. Why had I brought her up? "She's fine," he said, sounding a little surprised. "Why?" "No reason," I said, my heart racing. "You should come by sometime," he said casually. "I think she misses seeing you around." My stomach churned at his words. Did she miss me? Or was this some kind of test? Every interaction with him felt like a minefield, every word carefully chosen to avoid setting off a chain reaction I couldn't control. I wanted to tell him the truth sometimes, I even came close. But then I'd think about the fallout, about what it would do to him, to her, to all of us. So I stayed silent, carrying the weight of my guilt like a stone around my neck. But the thing about guilt is, it doesn't just sit there. It grows, festers, takes root in every corner of your mind until it becomes impossible to ignore. And no matter how much I tried to push it down, it always found a way to resurface. I'd catch myself replaying that night, wondering if I could have stopped it. If I should have. Maybe if I'd said something different, done something different, we wouldn't be here. But then I'd remember the way she'd looked at me, the way she'd opened up in a way no one else ever had. And that's where the moral ambiguity came in. Were we wrong? Probably. But did it feel wrong in the moment? No. It felt inevitable. Like it was something that was always going to happen, no matter how much we tried to fight it. And that's what kept me up at night. Not just the guilt, but the longing. Because as much as I hated myself for what we'd done, I couldn't deny that I wanted more. More of her, more of the connection we'd found in each other. It was a dangerous thought, one I tried to bury every time it came up. But it was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, whispering to me when I was at my weakest. I started avoiding Ethan more and more, making excuses every time he asked to hang out. I couldn't face him, couldn't look him in the eye without feeling like a fraud. And every time I dodged him, the guilt grew worse. But the hardest part was the silence. She hadn't reached out since that night, and I hadn't either. It was like an unspoken agreement, a way of pretending that nothing had happened. But the longer the silence stretched on, the more unbearable it became. Did she regret it? Did she feel the same way I did, caught between guilt and longing, unsure of how to move forward? Or had she decided that it was better to forget, to pretend that night never existed? The not knowing was its own kind of torture. One night, I found myself standing outside her house, my heart pounding as I debated whether to knock. The lights were on, and I could see her silhouette through the window, moving around the kitchen. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, my feet rooted to the ground as my mind raced with every possible scenario. What would I even say to her? What could I say? But before I could make a decision, the light in the kitchen went out, and I realized I couldn't do it. Not yet. I walked away, my chest heavy with the weight of everything I couldn't bring myself to say. And as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized that this wasn't something I could run from forever. Eventually, the truth would come out, whether I wanted it to or not. The only question was, when it did, would any of us be ready for it? And that's where I'm stuck. Right here, caught in the middle of a mess I never meant to create, trying to figure out what comes next. Let me ask you something. What would you do in my shoes? Seriously, think about it. Imagine you're standing there, torn between the person you've always been and the person you're becoming, the one you're not even sure you recognize anymore. Do you tell the truth? Risk losing the people you care about and shattering the life you've built? Or do you keep it a secret, hoping it never comes to light, even as the guilt eats away at you? Have you ever been in a situation where right and wrong weren't so black and white? Where the lines blurred so much you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began? If you have, I want to hear about it. I need to hear about it. Maybe your story will help me figure out mine. Drop a comment below and tell me what you'd do. Be honest, I can take it. And hey, if this story hit you as hard as it's hitting me, do me a favor. Like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel. This isn't the end of the journey, I can promise you that. There's so much more to unpack, and I'm going to need you right here with me as I figure it all out. This story is messy, complicated, real, and trust me when I say, you don't want to miss what happens next. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications. Stick around, because I'm about to take you deeper into the parts of life we don't talk about, the parts that make us question who we are and what we stand for. This isn't just my story, it's our story. It's about the choices we make, the people we hurt, and the lengths we'll go to find connection, even when it comes at a cost. Thank you for being here, for listening, for trying to make sense of this with me. I'll see you in the next chapter. And trust me, it's going to be one hell of a ride. You know, if I've learned anything through all of this, it's that life is messy. So much messier than we ever imagine it could be. We grow up thinking that the lines are clear, that the rules are simple. Right is right, and wrong is wrong. But then life happens, and you realize how easy it is to cross those lines, sometimes without even meaning to. It doesn't take much. A moment of weakness, a decision made in the heat of the moment, a connection you never saw coming. And suddenly, you're standing on the other side of a line you thought you'd never cross, wondering how the hell you got there. And those moments? They stay with you. Forever. They haunt you in the quiet hours, in the spaces between distractions, when there's nothing left to do but sit with yourself and the choices you've made. They force you to confront parts of yourself you didn't even know existed, parts you're not sure you want to face. But here's the thing, those moments, as painful and confusing as they are, also teach you something. About who you are, about what you want, about what you're willing to risk and what you're willing to lose. I don't know where this story ends yet. I don't know what the fallout will be or if I'll ever be able to make peace with what happened. What I do know is that I can't undo it. I can't go back to the person I was before that night. And maybe that's the hardest part. Not the guilt, not the fear of being found out, but the realization that I'm not the person I thought I was. But here's where it gets complicated. Because as much as I regret what happened, as much as I know it was wrong, I also can't bring myself to wish it away. That connection we shared, however fleeting, was real. It meant something. And no matter what happens next, it's a part of me now. So, what's the lesson here? If I had to sum it up, I'd say this. Be careful with the lines you draw. Because sometimes, the things you think are set in stone turn out to be as fragile as glass. And when they break, the pieces cut deep. And here's the thing, this story? It's not over. Not even close. If you think what you've heard so far is wild, trust me when I say, you haven't even scratched the surface. What happened next took everything I thought I knew about myself, about her, about Ethan, and turned it completely upside down. You won't believe the twists and turns the story is about to take. So stay tuned, because this ride is far from over. Make sure you're subscribed, turn on those notifications, and get ready for the next chapter. I promise you, it's going to be even messier, even more complicated, and way more shocking than anything you've heard so far. Thank you for being here, for listening, for trying to make sense of this with me. It means more than you know. And as always, if you have thoughts, advice, or your own story to share, drop it in the comments. I'll be reading every single one. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And remember, sometimes the lines we draw aren't as strong as we think. See you soon.